The taxi had barely stopped rolling before Grant Whitfield threw open the door, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, because after 3 long years of phone calls that dropped mid-sentence, of video chats frozen on his wife's smiling face, of birthdays and anniversaries spent staring at a ceiling on the other side of the world, he was finally home, and the first thing he saw through the kitchen window was his wife, Claire, laughing softly as she pressed a warm cloth to the forehead of a strange man sitting at their kitchen table wearing his robe. Before we go further into Grant and Claire's story, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, we'd love for you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story from our family. Your support means more to our community than you know, and it helps us keep bringing these stories of love and healing to people who need them. Now, let's continue. Grant stood frozen on the porch steps, his single duffel bag slipping from his shoulder and landing with a dull thud against the wooden planks. For 3 years he had imagined this exact moment 1,000 different ways, Claire running into his arms, tears streaming down both their faces, the smell of her hair, the warmth of her hands on his back after all those months of nothing but static and pixelated video calls from a drilling platform 400 miles off the coast of Norway. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had bought her a small silver locket in a market in Bergen, the kind of thing he imagined she would wear every day, a symbol that even though the ocean had kept them apart, his heart had never once wandered from her. But none of that mattered now, because what he saw through that window shattered every version of the homecoming he had built in his mind during the long, cold nights on that rig. The man in the kitchen looked to be in his 60s, his silver hair damp with sweat, his face pale and drawn, wearing Grant's own gray robe, the one Claire had given him for his 30th birthday, the one he had left folded on the hook behind their bedroom door when he flew out 3 years ago. Claire was leaning close to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, speaking in that soft, soothing voice Grant remembered so well, the voice she used to use on him when he was anxious or overwhelmed. And when the man reached up and covered her hand with his own, something inside Grant simply broke. He did not knock. He did not call out. He stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, watching the woman he had crossed oceans for care for another man in the home they had built together, in the robe that belonged to him, in the kitchen where they used to dance to old records on Sunday mornings before he left. And then, without a word, without giving Claire the chance to see him, to explain, to do anything at all, Grant picked up his bag, turned around, and walked away from the house that was supposed to be his homecoming. He did not know where he was walking. His feet simply carried him down the quiet suburban street, past the mailbox with the little painted birds Claire had decorated years ago, past the oak tree they had planted together the summer they got married, its branches now thick and full where it had once been a thin, hopeful sapling. Everything around him looked exactly the same, and yet nothing felt the same at all. The neighborhood he had dreamed about for 3 years, the one he had pictured every single night before falling asleep to the hum of machinery on that rig, now felt like a stranger's street, a place he no longer recognized, because the person waiting for him inside that house was not the person he thought he knew. By the time he reached the end of the block, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely pull his phone from his pocket. He did not call Claire. He could not bring himself to hear her voice, not yet, not when he did not trust himself to speak without his voice breaking or his anger spilling out in ways he might later regret. Instead, he called his younger brother, Foster, who lived 20 minutes away and who had always been the steady one, the one who kept his composure when everyone else around him fell apart. Foster answered on the second ring, his voice bright with surprise. "Grant? You're back early, man. I thought your flight didn't land until..." He stopped mid-sentence, clearly hearing something in his brother's silence that told him this was not a happy homecoming call. "Grant, what's wrong? Where are you? Can I stay with you for a few days?" Grant asked, his voice flat and hollow, stripped of all the excitement that should have filled it after 3 years apart from everyone he loved. Foster did not ask questions on the phone. He simply told his brother to stay put, that he would come get him, and 20 minutes later his car pulled up beside the curb where Grant sat on a low stone wall with his duffel bag between his feet, staring blankly at nothing. It was only once they were driving, the late morning sun slanting warm and gold through the windshield, that Foster finally asked what had happened, and Grant, in a voice that cracked more than once, told him everything he had seen through that kitchen window. Foster was quiet for a long moment, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He had known Claire for almost as long as Grant had. She had become like a sister to him over the years, the kind of person who remembered his birthday every year and always saved him the last slice of pie at family dinners. What Grant was describing did not sound like the Claire he knew, but he also knew better than to argue with his brother in this state, so instead he simply said, "Are you sure about what you saw? Sometimes things aren't what they look like." "I know what I saw, Foster," Grant snapped, then immediately softened, rubbing his hands over his tired face. "I'm sorry. I flew for 18 hours to get home. I hadn't slept properly in 2 days because I couldn't stop thinking about seeing her again. And then I walk up to my own house and find some strange man in my robe, and she's touching his hand like she used to touch mine." Foster did not respond right away. Instead, he reached over and squeezed his brother's shoulder, the way their father used to do when they were boys and the world felt too heavy to carry alone. "Stay with me tonight," he said quietly. "Sleep. Eat something. We'll figure out what's going on tomorrow, when your head is clearer." That first day, Grant did not sleep, not really. He lay on the pull-out couch in Foster's spare room, staring at the ceiling as the afternoon light slowly shifted and faded into evening, replaying the image over and over in his mind, Claire's hand on the stranger's shoulder, the stranger's hand covering hers, the softness in her voice that Grant had once believed belonged only to him. He thought about the 3 years he had spent away from her, working brutal 12-hour shifts on a platform surrounded by nothing but gray ocean and colder gray skies, all so they could pay off the debt from Claire's late mother's medical bills and finally start saving for the family they had always talked about having. He thought about every phone call where Claire had told him she missed him, every letter she had mailed to the rig even though it took weeks to arrive, every small gift she had sent, a hand-knitted scarf, a photograph of herself standing in their garden, a recording of her reading him a bedtime story like they used to do for each other when he could not sleep. None of it made sense with what he had just witnessed. And that contradiction, more than anything else, was what kept him staring at the ceiling long after the sun had set outside Foster's window. Claire, meanwhile, had no idea any of this had happened. She had spent that morning, as she had spent every morning for the past 9 days, caring for a man she did not know, a man the local hospital had brought to her attention after their volunteer program ran out of beds and resources during an unusually difficult month. Claire worked as a home care nurse, splitting her time between 3 elderly patients in the neighborhood and volunteering with a small community outreach group that helped find temporary housing for patients who had nowhere else to recover after being discharged. 9 days earlier, she had received a call from Rosalind Carver, the coordinator of the outreach program and a longtime family friend, explaining that a man had been found unconscious on the side of the highway after apparently being struck by a hit-and-run driver while walking along the shoulder. He had no wallet, no phone, no identification of any kind, and when he woke up in the hospital 3 days later, he could not remember his own name. The hospital, overwhelmed and understaffed, especially with a flu outbreak filling half their beds that month, needed to discharge him quickly, but he had no family to return to, no address, nothing. Rosalind had asked Claire, gently, carefully, knowing how much Claire had once loved and lost, if she might be willing to take him in temporarily while the outreach program worked to identify him and locate any family he might have. Claire had hesitated only for a moment before saying yes, because 11 years earlier, when Claire was just 22 years old and her own mother, Eleanor, had suffered a stroke while traveling alone through a small town 3 hours from home, it had been a stranger, an elderly woman named Margaret who ran a small bed and breakfast, who had found Eleanor collapsed on the sidewalk, taken her in, called for help, and stayed by her hospital bedside until Claire could arrive. Margaret had never asked for anything in return. She had simply said that when someone needs help, you help them, because someday it might be you, or someone you love, lying on a sidewalk hoping a stranger will stop. Claire had never forgotten that kindness, and when Rosalind called asking for help with the injured man, she thought of Margaret immediately, and she knew she could not say no. The man's name, they would later learn, was Walter Emerson, a retired schoolteacher who had, according to the fragments of memory slowly returning to him over those 9 days, been walking along that stretch of highway on his way to visit his daughter, from whom he had been estranged for almost 6 years following a painful falling out after his wife's death. Walter could remember pieces of his life: a classroom full of children, the smell of chalk dust, a piano his late wife used to play, but he could not remember his daughter's name, could not remember where she lived, could not remember why the two of them had stopped speaking in the first place. The confusion and grief of not knowing was, Claire quickly realized, more painful for him than the physical injuries from the accident, and so she had spent those 9 days not just changing his bandages and monitoring his recovery, but sitting with him at the kitchen table for hours, gently asking questions, showing him old photographs from local newspapers in case anything sparked recognition, holding his hand when the frustration of forgetting became too much for him to bear alone. That particular morning, the morning Grant had walked up to the house after 3 years away, Walter had woken with a fever, his body still fighting off a lingering infection from the accident, and Claire had been pressing a cool cloth to his forehead exactly as Grant had seen, trying to bring his temperature down before deciding whether she needed to take him back to the hospital. When Walter, disoriented and frightened by the fever, had reached out and taken her hand, it had not been out of any romantic intention at all, but simply the desperate need of a frightened, memory-lost man clinging to the one person who had shown him kindness in the confusing days since his accident. Claire had let him hold her hand because that was who Claire was, a woman who gave comfort freely to anyone who needed it, without calculation, without hesitation. She had no idea, as she sat there that morning soothing a stranger's fever, that outside her window, the husband she had waited 3 years for had come and gone, his heart shattered by a misunderstanding neither of them yet knew had happened. It was not until that evening, when Claire finally checked her phone after Walter's fever had broken and he had fallen into an exhausted, peaceful sleep, that she saw the missed messages, first from Grant's airline confirming his flight had landed on time that morning, and then, more alarmingly, 3 unanswered calls from Grant himself, all made within a 10-minute window around 11 o'clock that morning, followed by nothing at all. Her stomach dropped. She called him back immediately, her hands trembling, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. And again. Nothing. Panic began to creep into her chest as she paced the length of the kitchen, trying to piece together what could have happened. Had something gone wrong with his flight after all? Had there been an accident? She called the airline, who confirmed the flight had landed safely and on schedule. She called Foster, whose number she still had saved from years of family gatherings, and when he answered, his voice was strangely cautious, careful in a way that immediately told her something was wrong. "Foster, is Grant with you? Please, I need to know he's okay," she said, her voice cracking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Foster finally spoke. "He's here. He's safe. But Claire, he's not doing well. He said he came to the house this morning and saw you with some man, and he thinks something's going on between you two." Claire felt the air leave her lungs entirely. She sank down into one of the kitchen chairs, the same chair Walter had been sitting in only hours earlier, and for a moment she could not speak at all, could not process how spectacularly, painfully wrong Grant's assumption was, and how much damage that single misunderstanding might have already caused to the marriage she had spent 3 years fighting to hold together across an ocean. "Foster, listen to me," she finally said, her voice steadying with determination even as tears slipped down her cheeks. "That man is not what Grant thinks he is. His name is Walter. He was in an accident. He has no memory, no family we could locate, nowhere else to go. I've been taking care of him through the outreach program, the same one Rosalind runs. Please, please tell Grant to call me. Please tell him none of what he thinks is true." Foster promised he would talk to his brother, though he warned Claire, gently, that Grant was in no state to hear anything that night, that his heart had been broken too badly and too suddenly for reason to reach him just yet. Claire understood, even through her own devastation, because she knew Grant well enough to know that when he felt hurt, he retreated inward, building walls that took time and patience to bring down. She spent that night sitting at her kitchen table long after Walter had fallen asleep in the guest room, staring at her phone, willing it to ring, praying that somehow, some way, Grant would call so she could explain everything before the misunderstanding grew any larger in his mind. He did not call that night. Nor the next morning. Claire, refusing to simply wait in hope, decided she needed to take action herself. She spent the following day making calls, first to Rosalind, asking her to write a formal letter on behalf of the outreach program confirming Walter's situation and Claire's involvement in his care, and then to the hospital records department, requesting whatever documentation they could provide about Walter's admission and discharge. She gathered every piece of evidence she could find that might prove the truth of what had actually been happening in her home, because she knew that words alone, spoken through a phone Grant was refusing to answer, might not be enough to undo the image that had shattered his heart. Meanwhile, Grant spent those 2 days in a fog of grief and anger that even he did not fully understand. Part of him wanted desperately to believe there was an explanation, that the woman who had written him letters filled with such tenderness and longing could not possibly have betrayed him the way his mind kept insisting she had. But another part of him, the part shaped by exhaustion and heartbreak and 3 years of loneliness, could not stop replaying that image through the window, could not stop hearing the soft, familiar warmth in Claire's voice directed at someone who was not him. Foster tried repeatedly to convince his brother to at least listen to what Claire had to say, but Grant kept insisting he was not ready, that he needed time to think, that hearing her voice right now would only make the pain worse before it could get better. It was Rosalind Carver who ultimately broke through where everyone else had failed. On the 3rd day, having heard from Claire about the entire devastating misunderstanding, Rosalind drove directly to Foster's house without calling ahead, carrying with her a folder of documents, the outreach program's intake forms for Walter Emerson, the hospital discharge paperwork listing Claire as his temporary caregiver, and a handwritten note from Rosalind herself explaining exactly how and why Claire had taken Walter into her home. She knocked on Foster's door and asked, quite firmly for a woman well into her 60s, to speak with Grant directly. Grant, worn down by 2 sleepless nights and the quiet, patient persistence of his brother, finally agreed to see her. Rosalind sat across from him at Foster's kitchen table, her weathered hands folded calmly in front of her, and spoke to him not with judgment or anger, but with the steady compassion of someone who had spent decades helping people through their darkest moments. "I've known Claire since she was a little girl," Rosalind told him. "I watched her grow into one of the kindest women I have ever known. When I called her 9 days ago and asked if she could take in a man who had nowhere else to go, a man who couldn't even remember his own name, she didn't hesitate for a single second. She said yes before I even finished explaining the situation. That is who your wife is, Grant. That has always been who she is." She slid the folder across the table toward him. "I understand why what you saw through that window broke your heart. I would have felt the same way in your position. But I'm asking you, please, before you let 3 years of love slip away over a misunderstanding, look at what's in this folder, and then go home and let your wife explain the rest herself." Grant opened the folder with trembling hands. He read through the intake forms, the hospital paperwork, Rosalind's handwritten note, and as he read, something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 2 days began, slowly, painfully, to loosen. He thought about every year of their marriage before he left for the rig, every time he had watched Claire stay up late helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, every stray cat she had fed on their porch until she found it a proper home, every ounce of the boundless, unguarded kindness that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. He thought about how unfair it was that the very quality he loved most about her, her instinct to care for anyone who needed it, was the same quality that had, through nothing but tragic timing, nearly cost them everything. He looked up at Rosalind, his eyes wet, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he still there? At the house?" Rosalind nodded gently. "He is. And so is your wife, waiting for you, even after 2 days of silence, still waiting." Grant did not waste another moment. He thanked Rosalind, embraced his brother tightly, and asked Foster to drive him home immediately, unable to bear the thought of Claire spending even one more hour believing he had abandoned her without giving her the chance to explain. The drive felt endless despite taking only 20 minutes, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the familiar streets of the neighborhood, past the mailbox with the painted birds, past the oak tree they had planted together, all of it looking exactly the same as it had 2 days earlier and yet feeling entirely different now that Grant understood what he had actually witnessed. When the car pulled up outside the house, Grant saw Claire sitting on the front porch steps, exactly where he had once imagined she would be waiting to welcome him home. Her eyes were red and swollen from 2 days of crying, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, but when she saw him step out of Foster's car, she rose to her feet so quickly the mug nearly slipped from her hands. Neither of them said anything at first. They simply stood there, 10 feet apart, 3 years and 2 devastating days of misunderstanding stretched between them, until Grant closed the distance in a few long strides and pulled her into his arms so tightly that she gasped. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent he had missed every single night for 3 years, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears he no longer tried to hold back. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't call, I'm so sorry I ran instead of asking you, I should have trusted you, I should have known you better than that." Claire pulled back just enough to look up at him, her own tears streaming freely now. "You should have," she said softly, "but I understand why you didn't. You flew across the world, exhausted, missing me for 3 years, and then you saw something that would have broken anyone's heart. I'm not angry at you, Grant. I'm just so relieved you're finally here, that we get to fix this before it became something neither of us could come back from." They stood on that porch for a long while, simply holding each other, letting the relief and the love and the lingering ache of those 2 painful days wash over them both. When they finally stepped inside the house together, hand in hand, Grant saw Walter sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his fever fully broken now, color returned to his face, watching the reunion with a look of quiet, grateful understanding. Grant walked over and extended his hand, and Walter shook it firmly, an unspoken apology and forgiveness passing between 2 men who, only days earlier, had unknowingly been at the center of a heartbreak neither of them had intended to cause. "Thank you for taking care of him," Grant said quietly to Claire, glancing between her and Walter. "I'm sorry I ever doubted who you were." Over the following days, as Grant settled back into life at home, he came to know Walter not as a threat to his marriage, but as a gentle, thoughtful man whose situation moved him deeply once he understood the full weight of it. He listened as Claire and Rosalind explained the ongoing effort to help Walter recover his memory and locate his estranged daughter, and Grant, feeling a need to make up for the 2 days of doubt that had nearly cost him everything, threw himself into helping with the search. He used skills he had picked up over years of working in logistics on the rig, cross-referencing old school district records, searching community forums, and eventually, after nearly 2 weeks of painstaking effort, they found her, a woman named Judith Emerson, now living 3 states away, who had, it turned out, spent the past several months searching for her own father after her attempts to reconcile with him had gone unanswered because Walter, in the depths of his grief over his late wife, had moved without telling anyone and lost contact with almost everyone in his life, including, tragically, the daughter he loved more than anything. The day Judith arrived at Grant and Claire's house, having driven 9 hours straight after receiving the call that her father had been found, was one none of them would ever forget. Walter, who had spent the past weeks regaining fragments of memory but still struggling to recall his daughter's face clearly, stood on the porch when her car pulled into the driveway, his hands shaking with a mixture of hope and fear. When Judith stepped out of the car and their eyes met across the yard, something in Walter's face shifted, a wave of recognition breaking through the fog that had clouded his mind for weeks, and he began to weep before she had even reached him. "Dad," Judith said, her voice breaking as she ran toward him, "I've been looking for you for so long. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I said before you left." Walter pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her the way a man holds someone he thought he might never see again, and the 2 of them stood there on the porch, 6 years of estrangement and painful silence finally dissolving into forgiveness. Grant and Claire watched from the doorway, tears in both their eyes, holding hands tightly, each of them understanding in that moment just how fragile and precious the people we love truly are, and how quickly misunderstanding and silence can steal away the time we are given with them if we let it. Judith stayed with them for a week while Walter continued his recovery, and during that time, Grant found himself reflecting often on how close he had come to losing everything over a moment of doubt, how easily fear and exhaustion had nearly convinced him to walk away from the very love he had crossed an ocean to return to. He thought about the 3 years he had spent working on that rig, telling himself every single night that he was doing it for their future together, and how strange and humbling it was to realize that the greatest test of that future had not come from the distance or the loneliness of those years apart, but from a single misunderstood moment on the very day he came home. He talked with Claire at length about it, late one evening as they sat together in the garden, the golden afternoon light stretching long shadows across the grass, and she told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "Love isn't just about being loyal when you're far apart," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. "It's about trusting each other enough to ask the question before you assume the worst. We both have to promise each other that, from now on. No more running. No more silence. Just talking to each other, even when it's hard, even when we're scared of what the answer might be." Grant promised her that, and he meant it with everything in him. Before we reach the end of this story, we'd love to hear from you. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you of the importance of trust, patience, and giving the people we love the benefit of the doubt, please take a moment to leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you, or a time in your own life when a misunderstanding almost cost you something precious before the truth set things right. Your comments mean the world to our community, and they remind us why we tell these stories in the first place. Walter's recovery continued steadily over the following months, his memories returning in fuller, clearer pieces with each passing week, though he would later say that some of the most meaningful memories he made were not the ones he recovered from before the accident, but the new ones formed during those strange, difficult weeks in Grant and Claire's home. The mornings Claire had sat with him over tea patiently helping him piece together fragments of his past, the afternoon Grant had spent hours on the phone tracking down old school district records just to help a man he had, at first, wrongly believed was the source of his heartbreak. Walter eventually moved in with Judith, closer to her own family, but he and his daughter made a point of visiting Grant and Claire every few months, a tradition that grew, over the years, into something resembling an extended family bound not by blood but by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them all together. Grant, for his part, made the decision not to return to the offshore rig once his current contract concluded. He and Claire had saved enough during those 3 hard years apart to finally put a down payment on the small landscaping business Grant had always dreamed of starting, something that would keep him close to home, close to Claire, close to the life they had both sacrificed so much to build. It was not always easy, starting a business from nothing rarely is, but every evening Grant came home to Claire, every ordinary Tuesday dinner and quiet Sunday morning they shared together, felt like a gift he no longer took for granted, a gift he had almost let slip away over a misunderstanding born of exhaustion and fear rather than any real betrayal. Years later, when people in the neighborhood would ask Grant and Claire about the small framed photograph that hung in their hallway, a picture of the 4 of them, Grant, Claire, Walter, and Judith, taken on the porch during one of the family's visits, all of them laughing at something just out of frame, Grant would often tell an abbreviated version of the story, leaving out the rawest, most painful parts of those 2 days of silence and doubt, focusing instead on the lesson at the heart of it, that the people we love deserve the chance to explain, that assumptions born of fear can shatter in an instant what took years to build, and that sometimes the very qualities that make someone worth loving, their boundless kindness, their instinct to help even a stranger in need, can, through nothing but cruel timing, look like something entirely different from a distance. Claire, whenever she told the story herself, always ended it the same way, holding Grant's hand across the kitchen table where it had all nearly fallen apart and where, ultimately, it had all come back together. She would say that love is not the absence of doubt or fear, but the willingness to walk back through the door, to ask the question instead of running from the answer, to choose trust even when the evidence in front of your eyes seems to be telling you something else entirely. She would say that forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not about pretending the pain never happened, but about choosing, together, to build something stronger from the broken pieces than what existed before. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Stories like Grant and Claire's remind us that even in our darkest, most uncertain moments, kindness and forgiveness have the power to heal what fear nearly destroys, and that the people we love are always worth the courage it takes to ask one more question before we let go. Thank you for being part of our community, and for believing, alongside us, in second chances.